It is often forgotten that during the reign of Elizabeth I, England's relationship with the Muslim world was more extensive and more amicable than at any other time in history, until today. After Elizabeth was dramatically excommunicated from the Roman Catholic Church by the Pope in 1570, the Queen and her advisers determined to reach out beyond Europe to the Islamic powers of Turkey, Persia, and Morocco, in the hope of forging a new alliance against their common enemy, Catholic Spain. By the late 1500s, Elizabethan trade with the Turkish Ottoman Empire was booming. The Levant Company alone had 20 ships exporting cloth to the Mediterranean. The impact of all this trade could be seen at various levels of Elizabethan life. In terms of English printed books alone, there was a notable surge of interest in the Muslim world, and more than 60 books were published in Elizabeth's reign on subjects relating to the Turks. Even the language of 16th century England was full of new words drawn from its commercial exchanges with Islamic countries. Sugar and candy, turquoise or Turkey stone, crimson, indigo, tulip, and even zero all entered the English language during this Elizabethan period. The Tudor fascination with the Islamic world went back at least as far as the reign of Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII. He and his court enjoyed wearing Turkish clothing, with the king often described as appearing at festivities apparelled after Turkey fashion, dressed in silk and velvet, and sporting a turban and a scimitar, adopting a Turkish style that is now regarded as characteristically Tudor. As well as rich silk, velvet, and other fabrics, Tudor merchants imported exotic commodities from Islamic lands that included cotton, rhubarb, currants, sweet wines, and intricate textiles, as well as the Moroccan sugar that Elizabeth consumed in copious quantities. As early as the 1550s, Englishmen were doing business in Muslim countries as far apart as Morocco and Syria, travelling by land and sea, exchanging ideas and beliefs with Muslims from different social groups and religious denominations. One of these Englishmen was Anthony Jenkinson. Although scarcely remembered today, during his lifetime, Jenkinson was regarded as one of the great pioneers of Elizabethan travel. He served his apprenticeship as a merchant, specializing in textiles, and in his late teens he left England and travelled across Europe, North Africa, and the Mediterranean islands. In November 1553, when he was just 24, Jenkinson reached the Syrian city of Aleppo. Together with its neighbour Damascus, Aleppo is one of the oldest cities in the world. It stood then at the western end of the Silk Route, and was renowned for its trade in Iranian silk and Indian spices, attracting merchants from the east and the west for centuries. By the time Jenkinson arrived, it was widely regarded as the Islamic world's equivalent to Venice. But that November, a very different visitor came marching into the city. Jenkinson was there as Sultan Suleiman I entered Aleppo, at the head of a vast Turkish army, embarking on a campaign against the neighbouring Persian Safavid Empire. Jenkinson watched in wonder as one of the 16th century's finest armies swept past, led by the great Turk himself, Sultan Suleiman. Jenkinson's experience as a cloth merchant ensured that his description of the scene reads more like a fashion show than a military campaign. He watched as an estimated 88,000 men marched past.
The cavalry were clothed all in scarlet, the infantry all in yellow velvet, with hats of the same, of the Tartary fashion, 2 foot long, with a great robe of the same colour about their foreheads.
The Sultan's elite fighting corps, the Janissaries, were wearing silk and hats with a strange shape. This was the famous Turkish Bork hat,
in the manner of a French hood, topped with a great bush which wavereth up and down most bravely when he marcheth.
Finally Suleiman himself appeared, mounted upon a white horse that was adorned with a cloth of gold, richly embroidered with precious stones. as it was for many European painters of the time, including Bellini, Dürer, Titian, and Veronese. It was the Sultan's headgear that fascinated Jenkinson.
Suleiman wore upon his head a goodly white turban, containing in length by estimation 15 yards, which was of silk and linen woven together, resembling something of calicut cloth, but is much more fine and rich, and in the top of his crown a little pinnach of white ostrich feathers.
It was such dazzling displays of power and panache that earned Suleiman the sobriquet the Magnificent. However, the Sultan was not free from personal problems. In his early 60s, he was beset with illness and domestic squabbles between various wives and 8 politically ambitious sons, and was particularly suspicious of his youngest, Prince Mustafa. Just weeks before Jenkinson marvelled at those forces marching into Aleppo, Suleiman had camped in central Anatolia and called Prince Mustafa into his tent, where his eunuchs strangled him with a bowstring, as his father looked on. Portraits of the Turkish sultans could be found in many of England's great houses. In 1575, the poet, courtier, and soldier Sir Philip Sidney was delighted to receive a portrait of the new Emperor of the Turks, Sultan Murad III. Painted in Venice, this portrait, alongside Sidney's extensive knowledge of Turkish matters, had a significant influence on his poetry and prose. As well as depicting figures from the Muslim world, Elizabethan portraiture revelled in reproducing the growing volume of Oriental imports flowing into London. These included opulent and expensive Islamic fabrics, rugs, carpets, embroideries, and even Iznik pottery made in Bursa in Turkey. The pearls, diamonds, sapphires, silks, brocades, and damasks that feature in so many Elizabethan paintings, including those of the Queen herself, were self-conscious displays of the Anglo-Islamic trade's success. This luxuriousness was not confined to kings, queens, and noblemen. The importation of cotton wool from Turkish merchants stimulated a burgeoning textile industry in Lancashire, and by the end of Elizabeth's reign, the manufacture of raw silk from Iran provided employment for hundreds of workers who produced clothes in the Turkish manner and household furnishings for middle-class consumption. The resulting objects were such a common feature in wealthy Elizabethan homes and domestic life that Shakespeare felt confident enough to make references in his comedies to Turkey cushions bossed with pearl in The Taming of the Shrew, and to Turkish tapestry in The Comedy of Errors. Despite such casual references, Shakespeare, his contemporaries, and their queen would not have recognized the term Muslim. In 16th century England, when understanding of the theology of Islam was sketchy and contradictory, various words were used to describe its followers: Mohammedans, Ottomites, Saracens, Persians, Moors, pagans, or Turks. The latter often a catch-all term for anyone who would be recognized today as a Muslim. Such words embraced a range of beliefs and assumptions, from horror and disgust to wonder and curiosity. At virtually no point was there an attempt to understand Islam on its own terms. In the summer of 1581, a play appeared that dramatized the issues of trade, money, religion, and national differences generated by events in and around Turkey. Its author was Robert Wilson, a talented young actor and playwright, and it was called The Three Ladies of London. Wilson's play is a clumsy melodrama and has not stood the test of time, but its topicality was unquestionable. It addressed the hopes and anxieties of a Turkish trade that was enriching England, but at a great cost to the national conscience and its religion. The play struck a chord in the upper echelons of the English Church. The Bishop of London wrote a letter to the Lord Mayor attacking the morality of the Anglo-Turkish trade.
Surely, in mine opinion, it is very strange and dangerous that the desire of worldly and transitory things should carry men so far with such kind of traffic, which neither our ancestors before us knew of, nor can be attempted without selling of souls for purchasing of money, to the great blemish of our religion and the shame of our country.
The bishop went on to complain about the fate of
certain miserable captives in Turkey.
He hoped that these Englishmen could be ransomed with the help of collections held in London churches, and
redeemed out of that hellish thraldom where they be, to the great danger of their souls.
They were not the only Englishmen held captive by the Turks. In May of 1584, the Turkey Company's ship Jesus was seized, its cargo confiscated, and its crew imprisoned in Tripoli in Libya. The vessel's fate might have remained unknown had it not been for its resourceful boatswain, who managed somehow to smuggle a letter out of captivity to his father in Tavistock in Devon. He told stories of raiding Greek vessels trading African slaves, and of his compatriots being compelled to turn Turk through graphically described forced circumcision. When he heard the news, William Harborne, England's ambassador in Turkey, wrote to the ruler of Tripoli, demanding that he release the ship, cargo, and crew immediately. The Englishman warned the Pasha that unless he redeemed the crew and cargo,
"You will answer in another world unto God alone, and in this world unto the Grand Signior for this heinous crime, committed by you against so many poor souls, which by this your cruelty are in part dead, and in part detained by you in most miserable captivity."
The letter succeeded. The captives were released, and mostly melted away into the Mediterranean littoral, never to be heard of again. Complaints like the Bishop of London's had little discernible impact on the city's merchants, or on Elizabeth's advisers. On the contrary, plans were being hatched to expand their commerce with Turkey and Morocco. When it came to trade, material interests insidiously prevailed over religious and moral ones. The Spanish ambassador had already written to his king, Philip II, expressing anxiety about the Anglo-Turkish trade, stating that it was extremely profitable for the English. The ambassador added that with the Turks' collusion, the English might monopolize the drug and spice trades. In fact, the English had nowhere near the resources to achieve such a global monopoly. But his letter was a sign of how far their success in the East had rattled the Spanish. As far as the Spanish ambassador could discern, the scale of the English diplomatic achievements in Persia, Morocco, and Turkey suggested that when it came to Elizabethan trade with the Islamic world, anything was possible. In the late 16th century, Protestant England regarded Islam, with its refusal to worship icons and its venerating of a holy book, as a faith with which it could do business. Following her excommunication by Pope Pius V in 1570, Queen Elizabeth actively encouraged English merchants to trade with other non-Catholic countries, and within a few years England was exporting goods like cloth and timber to Islamic Morocco, and importing more than 250 tons of sugar each year. However, Elizabethan England had no diplomatic or commercial ties with the Turkish Empire, then regarded as the world's most powerful and successful military machine. Elizabeth's advisers knew that even the possibility of an Anglo-Turkish alliance would be viewed with genuine alarm in Spain and Italy, and seen as a direct threat to Catholic influence in Europe and the Mediterranean. They would do anything they could to prevent it. In the summer of 1578, the Queen's principal secretary, Sir Francis Walsingham, came up with a solution.
To make choice of some apt man to be sent with Her Majesty's letters unto the Turk to procure an ample safe conduct, who is always to remain there at the charge of the merchants.
It was a shrewd proposal. Whoever was chosen would exploit the blurred line between trade and politics travelling secretly under royal warrant, but paid for by London's merchants. He would remain in Constantinople indefinitely to thwart attempts by resident Venetian, French, and Spanish merchants or diplomats to disrupt the English trade. The apt man chosen to lead England's hazardous foray into the Islamic world was William Harborne. Born into the minor gentry, Harborne had been travelling abroad as a merchant for nearly 20 years. That summer, Harborne set off on a gruelling 4-month overland journey to Turkey. On his arrival, he must have experienced a combination of exhilaration and trepidation. Constantinople, known today as Istanbul, had changed beyond all recognition. From a city in decline and under siege, it had been transformed into the capital of the Islamic world. The city's iconic cathedral had been converted into a mosque, and an ambitious program of public building had created a new imperial palace, the Topkapi Sarai, as well as dozens of mosques, schools, bathhouses, and markets, turning it from a Greek Orthodox city into a Muslim one. Constantinople now had a population estimated at 500,000, twice the size of London or Paris. If the size and splendour of the city dazzled Harborne, his initial encounters with the Turkish political bureaucracy must have been completely bewildering. The first problem was one of communication. Harborne corresponded with his Turkish counterparts in Latin or Italian, which was then translated into Turkish, leaving much room for creative license and strategic misunderstanding. Then there was the difficulty of gaining formal access to the Turkish court. Once within the Topkapi Sarai Palace, visitors were met with a confusing series of layers under the governance of Sultan Murad III. The inner service was dominated by the harim, which was responsible for the Sultan's welfare. This included his wives, concubines, and slaves, and his consort, Sophia Sultan, who also exercised considerable influence over imperial policy. Fiscal and diplomatic responsibilities were delegated to the outer service, which was controlled by the Grand Vizier, who was appointed by the Sultan. Harborne's first task was to establish a dialogue with the Grand Vizier, Sokulu Mehmed Pasha. The wily Mehmed had not only survived, but prospered in the role for 14 years. But he was now locked in a bitter power struggle with the Sultan's consort, Safiye Sultan. Unsurprisingly, Harborne was oblivious to such courtly intrigue, not least because he had a disastrous start to his time in Constantinople. His woes were described in graphic detail in a petition to the Grand Vizier. Harborne complained that within weeks of his safe arrival, he had ordered goods and money to be sent to him by one of his servants,
who was then assassinated by thieves within 1 day's journey of this famous city, and they robbed him of his goods and money to the sum of 4,000 ducats.
That was about £1,300, which was a substantial amount. Frustratingly, Harborne's letters do not reveal if he received any compensation for the robbery. Despite having no formal mandate from Elizabeth, Harborne had bribed the Grand Vizier
with a quantity sufficient for 3 robes of the best English cloth,
in order to obtain commercial safe conduct agreements for English merchants. In exchange, the Grand Vizier had offered to send a letter from the Sultan to the Queen. The letters that followed were the first sustained exchange of correspondence between a Turkish Sultan and an English monarch, and would last for another 17 years. In early 1579, a letter was dictated on Sultan Murad's behalf. It was written in ink on a large piece of paper dusted with gold and sealed with an elaborate calligraphic monogram. Buried within the letter's honorific rhetoric was some shrewd realpolitik. The Sultan was careful to describe Elizabeth as one of the Christian worshippers of Jesus, and part of the family of Nazareth, implying the possibility of a Protestant-Islamic alliance, based on the mutual acceptance of Jesus as a holy figure. Her reply got down to business, asking for trading privileges to be
enlarged to all our subjects in general,
and agreeing that Turks should also be allowed
to come and go, to and from us and our kingdoms.
The letter concluded with a last request.
Your great affection to us and our nation doth cause us also to entreat and use mediation on the behalf of certain of our subjects, who are detained as slaves and captives in your galleys, that they may be delivered from their bondage and restored to liberty.
Those concerned were probably the crews of the Peter and Swallow, 2 English ships captured off Algiers 2 years earlier. For some, the plea brought release and redemption, although it earned for the English a mortal enemy, in the shape of the galley slave's owner, the Turkish Admiral Ali Pasha. Suddenly, the new relationship was faced with an unexpected crisis. As the Grand Vizier was listening to petitions in the Topkapi Palace, a dervish suddenly leapt forward and stabbed him to death. Rumours abounded that the Sultan's mother had ordered the assassination, but whatever the motivation, it represented a decisive shift in the balance of power within the palace. It is testament to William Harborne's determination and resourcefulness that he continued his dogged pursuit of an Anglo-Turkish agreement. His time spent wooing, and probably bribing, subsequent Grand Viziers infuriated the other resident European diplomats. However, after nearly 3 years, Harborne succeeded, and Sultan Murad III signed a Charter of Privileges, granting the English full commercial rights in Turkish dominions. Harborne now exploited the new agreement to consolidate a thriving commercial network across the Mediterranean and began trading with merchants from as far north as Poland to those from Algeria in the west and Syria in the east. Just as it seemed that Harborne had achieved more than anyone in London could have hoped, disaster struck again. In September 1580, the Bark Row, a merchant vessel carrying a cargo worth over £1,000, left London for the eastern Mediterranean. The ship's captain was Peter Baker, who was already known in London merchant circles as a greedy and evil man, having seized a ship in the Mediterranean 5 years earlier. He was responsible for a crew of around 70 and a ship armed with 24 cannon. The crew had been told that they were travelling as merchants, but after visiting Malta and selling all his cargo, Baker announced they were sailing for Turkey to act as pirates. He then attacked 2 ships off the coast of southern Greece, but the captured ship's passengers included priests from Patmos, which lay within the jurisdiction of the Turkish Admiral Ali Pasha, still smarting from having to surrender English galley slaves to Harborne just 2 years earlier. The Admiral immediately blamed the fiasco on the unsuspecting Englishman, demanding that the Sultan imprison him and revoke the trade agreements. Horrified, Harborne rushed back to Constantinople, from where he sent a letter to Elizabeth's Lord High Treasurer, Lord Burleigh. Baker's stupidity had driven Harborne to the brink of despair.
Behold in what pit of perplexity and snares of unluckiness I am entangled through the unchristian and detestable dealings of Peter Baker. The intolerable grief of mind which these pirates have caused me, I cannot utter.
His greatest fear was how Sultan Murad would respond. Harborne had good reason to panic. He admitted to Burleigh that he had used credit to buy merchandise and send it back to London, but that as a result of Baker's piracy, all his assets had been frozen, and he had no money to settle his debts. The Sultan revoked the English trade agreements and signed new ones with the French. Harborne's 3-year mission seemed in ruins. Meanwhile, Lord Burleigh advised Elizabeth to write a letter apologising to the Sultan in a bid to salvage something from the imperilled Anglo-Turkish trade. She must have been furious at having to grovel in this way, but after receiving her letter, the Turks proposed a new deal. They would restore the English privileges on condition that the Queen formalised trade and diplomatic relations and appointed an official ambassador to Turkey. The Crown responded by issuing letters patent to establish a new merchant company that was granted authority to trade into and from the dominions of the Great Turk. It would be called the Turkey Company. Harborne was rewarded with the renewal of the Anglo-Turkish treaty. It would endure for 343 years, until the collapse of the Turkish Empire after the First World War. Soon the new Turkey Company was thriving. It was exporting cloth and metal to the Mediterranean in return for silk, spices, cotton, currants, mohair, carpets, indigo and drugs. Both Murad III and Elizabeth were benefiting enormously from the trade and the strategic anti-Spanish military alliance that came with it. The Catholic powers were furious, but diplomatically there was little they could do. The French ambassador reiterated his demand that the Sultan expel William Harborne. But the Englishman responded coolly.
I think he won't be quite strong enough to turn me out.
He was right. In Turkey, at least, the English were there to stay. It is midday. According to the Muslim lunar calendar, it is 1,009 years since the Hijra, the emigration of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina. In the tilt yard of London's Whitehall Palace, on the site of today's Horse Guards Parade, stands a tall, dark, bearded man. He is instantly distinguished from the crowd by his long black robe, bright white linen turban, and the huge, richly decorated steel scimitar that hangs from his waist. His appearance and demeanour mark him out as a traveller of obvious stature, but also as an exotic and extravagant stranger, regarded with awe by many of those around him. Abd al-Wahid bin Masoud bin Mohammed al-Nouri, the 42-year-old Moroccan envoy to the court of Queen Elizabeth I, is halfway through his 6-month stay in London. He is there with orders to conclude an alliance that would unite English Protestants and Moroccan Muslims against their mutual opponent, Catholic Spain. Al-Nouri takes his place beneath a canopy specially constructed for him at one end of the yard, along with his Moroccan retinue. They're watching a jousting match between some of England's most famous lords and knights, who enter the lists in pairs on horseback to the blare of trumpets. Some are dressed in armour, others in elaborate disguises, accompanied by attendants reciting songs and verse. Al-Nouri and his entourage are surrounded by thousands of Londoners. Each has paid 12 pence to witness one of the great occasions in the Elizabethan calendar, the Accession Day Tilts, the annual celebration commemorating the day on which Queen Elizabeth I succeeded her Catholic sister Mary Tudor to the English throne. If he looks up, Al-Nouri can glimpse the Queen and her ladies watching the entertainment from the windows of one of the palace's galleries. From this distance, he cannot discern her blackened teeth, probably caused by the plentiful use of sugar, a condiment the Queen has been importing from Morocco since the beginning of her reign. Elizabeth's loyal subjects could have told Al-Nouri that, according to their Julian Christian calendar, the date was the 17th of November, 1600, exactly 42 years since Elizabeth came to the throne. We know what Al-Nouri looked like because that autumn the Moroccan ambassador sat for his portrait somewhere in London, and it offers a tantalizing glimpse of its subject and his presence in the city. The painting is now in the collection of the University of Birmingham, and it is remarkable not only as the earliest surviving portrait of a Muslim, painted from life in England, but also because his Sunni religion prohibited the use of figurative images. The ruler of Morocco, Sultan Ahmed al-Mansur, never showed his face in public and spoke from behind a veil. This year, the plans for the Accession Day tilts were more ambitious than ever, intended to show a kingdom at domestic peace. They were meant to be admired by Elizabeth's powerful French, Russian, and Moroccan allies. The Queen had outlived her adversary, the Spanish King Philip II, and although England was still officially at war with Spain, the threat of invasion had receded. But behind the tiltyard's glittering facade, the seemingly unalterable edifice of Elizabethan rule was starting to crumble. Elizabeth was growing old. Her refusal to marry or nominate a male heir left the kingdom confronting an imminent crisis of political succession. Even worse, the Queen was facing a political challenge from a virile young male pretender to her throne, Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. Handsome, charismatic, politically ambitious, and a champion of militant Protestantism, Essex was a strong advocate of war against Spain, a policy to which the naturally cautious Elizabeth did not want to commit herself. Essex had fallen from favour and had been placed under house arrest. He was, in fact, fortifying Essex House on the Strand, just a few hundred yards from the celebrations in Whitehall, preparing to lead an uprising against his sovereign. Even as rumours of a coup swept London, Elizabeth and her advisers had been busy hosting Al-Nouri in readiness for an alliance with Morocco that promised to cast the upstart Earl into political oblivion. Earlier that summer, a 16-man Moroccan delegation, together with a group of Dutch prisoners, had left Morocco on board the English ship the Eagle. Following their arrival in London, the Moroccan party had been taken in 4 coaches to Nonsuch Palace in Surrey, and an audience with the Queen. One eyewitness account of Al-Nouri's reception described the elaborate royal preparations for his visit.
Rich hangings and furniture sent for from Hampton Court. The guard very strong in their rich coats, the royal bodyguards with their axes, the lords of the Order of the Garter with their collars, and a full court of lords and ladies. The barbarians passed through a guard of halberds to the council chamber, so to the privy chamber, and so to the gallery, where Her Majesty sat at the further end in very great state, and gave them audience.
The formalities dispensed with, the Moroccan and English delegations began discussing the business in hand. One wonders what the handsome Moroccan diplomat made of the 67-year-old English monarch, as she was then very old by the standards of the age. If part of his mission was to assess the commercial impact of Moroccan sugar on the English economy, he would see it plainly enough when Elizabeth smiled. Their conversation, held in Spanish, then translated for the Queen, ostensibly dealt with commercial relations between the two crowns. But, as one of the English diplomats reported, at the end of the reception,
Her Majesty, for a further grace to the Dutch states agent, caused him to be present, and so she received the 9 Dutch prisoners of the barbarian with one hand, and she gave them to him with another.
Elizabeth was using the release of the captives to show off to the Dutch her power over Morocco, and her largesse in releasing fellow Protestants into the hands of her grateful Protestant allies. It stressed England's anti-Catholic alliance with the Dutch and the Moors, but also Elizabeth's alliance with the Muslim Turks. Many understood this to be a meeting of 3 of Catholic Spain's greatest political and theological enemies. Following the audience at Nonsuch, the Moroccan delegation returned to their central London lodgings on the Strand, without any clear resolution to their mission, But over the next few months, many at Elizabeth's court believed that what at first appeared to be just another trade delegation was actually a secret attempt to initiate an Anglo-Moroccan military alliance. The Moroccan ruler, Al-Mansur, believed they could rid the world of Catholic Spain altogether. Despite that, Elizabeth and her advisers were hesitant about the proposed military alliance, probably unconvinced by the likelihood of defeating the Spanish in their homeland and abroad. Instead, they offered Al-Nuri the opportunity to join the English forces in their more realistic, ongoing campaign raiding the Spanish fleet in the Caribbean. The Moroccan ruler Al-Mansur was asked to cover the costs. Al-Nuri rejected their proposal. However, it appears that another of their party, Haj Musa, led a revolt against him, possibly because they were interested in accepting the English offer. In October, the diarist John Chamberlain observed,
"The barbarians were yesterday at court to take their leave, and will be gone shortly. But the eldest of them, Haj Musa, which was a kind of priest or prophet, hath taken his leave of the world, and is gone to seek out Mohammed, their mediator."
Chamberlain's rather poor joke was followed by subsequent reports making much darker accusations.
"They poisoned their interpreter, being born in Granada, because he commended the estate and bounty of England. The like violence was thought to be done unto their reverend aged pilgrim, lest he should manifest England's honour to their disgrace. It was generally judged by their demeanours that they were rather spies than honourable ambassadors."
Had Al-Nuri really murdered 2 rebellious members of his party on the Strand, then ordered a hasty departure? Or were these rumours of murder and insurrection among the Moroccan delegation just malicious slander? As speculation grew, public hostility towards the Moroccans grew more pronounced, amid accusations that they were really in London as spies. One of Elizabeth's informers claimed that Al-Nuri's secret mission was to learn more about English merchandise, the prices, weights and measures of different commodities, and how much profit was made on Moroccan sugar, so they could raise their own prices accordingly. With no military or diplomatic agreement in sight, and London's merchants increasingly unhappy about the intelligence they believed Al-Nuri was gathering, it was clearly time for the Moroccans to leave. As they began to plan their departure, events conspired to hasten it. In January 1601, Elizabeth issued a proclamation with a direct bearing on Al-Nuri's retinue.
Whereas the Queen's Majesty, tendering the good and welfare of her own natural subjects, greatly distressed in these hard times of dearth, is highly discontented to understand the great number of Negroes and blackamoors which are carried into this realm since the troubles between Her Highness and the King of Spain, who are fostered and powered here to the great annoyance of her own liege people, that which covet the relief which these people consume, as also for that the most of them are infidels, having no understanding of Christ or his gospel, hath given a special commandment that the said kind of people shall be with all speed avoided and discharged out of this Her Majesty's realms.
The proclamation was a sign of the deteriorating political situation in England. The country was in a state of famine due to poor harvests and depopulation. Elizabeth's grip on power was slipping, and her immediate response was that of political leaders since time immemorial when faced with a crisis: attack economic immigrants, refugees fleeing religious persecution, and other aliens, and demand that they be deported. Meanwhile, even more dramatic events on the streets of London confirmed Al-Nuri's decision to go. In early February, the disaffected Earl of Essex left his house on the Strand and marched into the city with 300 armed followers. But Londoners refused to support him, and he was arrested for treason. 2 weeks later, he was beheaded at the Tower of London. His bellicose demands for war died with him. With London in turmoil, following the failed rebellion, al-Nuri and his surviving retinue slipped quietly away. War with Spain was now off the political agenda, for the moment at least, regardless of Queen Elizabeth's eager Islamic allies. In January 1595, Sultan Murad III died in the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople, now present-day Istanbul. In keeping with Turkish tradition, his death was kept secret until the Crown Prince, his heir, could reach the capital and ensure a smooth transition of power. 4 weeks later, the English ambassador received a letter from a Portuguese associate. He reported that Crown Prince Mehmed had arrived in Constantinople to claim the throne and bury his father in the imperial mosque. What followed next has become one of the most terrible and reviled acts in Turkish imperial history.
That night, his 19 new brothers were conducted to the King Sultan Mehmed. They were the male children then living of his father, by several wives. They were brought to kiss his hand, so that he should see them alive. The eldest of them was 11. Their king brother told them not to fear, as he did not wish to do them any harm, but only to have them circumcised, according to custom. And this was a thing that none of his ancestors had ever done, and directly they had kissed his hand, they were circumcised, taken aside, and dexterously strangled with handkerchiefs.
One eyewitness acknowledged that such a brutal act of political succession certainly seems a terrible and cruel thing, but it is the custom. He also conceded that the sight of all 19 coffins, some no bigger than a doll's, when they were placed next to their fathers, brought forth the tears of all the people. The Sultan's death was a critical moment in Anglo-Turkish relations. Most of Queen Elizabeth's diplomatic and commercial dealings with the Turks were based on a cordial, personal correspondence with the old Sultan that stretched back over 17 years, and more recently with his consort, Safiye, who was now elevated to the role of Queen Mother. It was unclear if Mehmed would be as sympathetic towards the English as his father had been. The signs were not promising. The English ambassador needed to act quickly if he was to retain Turkish favour. He wrote to London, hoping the Queen's advisers would see the wisdom of dispatching suitable gifts for the new Sultan to cement his diplomatic position. Unfortunately, the Privy Council was somewhat dilatory in its response, and no presents were forthcoming. They had still not been dispatched 3 years later. As Elizabeth's advisers debated how to satisfy Mehmed's demands for royal presents, a prominent writer called Richard Hakluyt published an attack on the hypocrisy of England's Catholic opponents and a spirited defence of its new Turkish alliance.
If any man shall take exception against this our new trade with Turks and misbelievers, he shall show himself a man of small experience in old and new histories, or wilfully led with partiality, or some worse humour. Who doth not acknowledge that either hath travelled the remote parts of the world, or read the histories of this later age, that the Spaniards and Portugals in Barbary, in the Indies, and elsewhere, have ordinary confederacy and traffic with the Moors and many kinds of Gentiles and pagans, and that which is more, do pay them pensions, and use them in their service and wars. Why then should that be blamed on us, which is usual and common to the most part of other Christian nations?
In other words, nobody could blame the English for working with the Turks or the Moors, because everyone was at it. Elizabeth chose the gifts personally, and they were, indeed, curious. One was a coach worth £600, intended for the Queen Mother, Safiye Sultan. A shrewd decision that not only continued their reciprocal exchange of gifts, but also enabled Elizabeth to cultivate the woman who it was believed had wielded ultimate power at the Turkish court since her son's accession. The other gift was even more elaborate: a clockwork musical organ, built and already played before Elizabeth, much to her satisfaction, by a musician and blacksmith from Wallington, called Thomas Dallam. It had been suggested to Elizabeth that she send the Sultan a clock in the form of a cock. Elizabeth clearly felt that a clockwork organ was better, and the following month, along with the coach, a consignment of cloth, and a team of artisans, including Dallam himself, the organ was packed up and put on board the Hector, a merchant ship bound for Turkey. In August 1599, the Hector reached its destination. Our ambassador was horrified to discover that Dallam's organ had been damaged on the long sea journey, alongside the consignment of ruined cloth, and with it possibly his hopes of receiving the Sultan's formal blessing. While the French and Venetian ambassadors worried about our religious ambitions, the querulous English ambassador was more concerned about Dallam. It must have been with mixed feelings that he watched the industrious Lancastrian quickly overcome the initial setback with his organ, spending the next month repairing, then reassembling it in front of a curious and increasingly expectant Turkish audience at the Topkapi Palace. At least the coach had arrived unscathed, and proved to be a success, as displayed by the somewhat incongruous sight of the Sultan and his mother riding around the city in it. When the organ's repairs were complete, Thomas Dallam was called to perform before an audience with the young Sultan in the inner sanctum of the Topkapi. As Sultan Mehmed entered, he demanded silence, and the 24-year-old blacksmith from Lancashire began to play in front of the most powerful ruler in the world.
All being quiet and no noise at all, the present began to salute the Grand Signior. First the clock struck 22, then the chime of 16 bells went off and played a song of 4 parts. That being done, 2 personages, which stood upon 2 corners of the 2nd story, holding 2 silver trumpets in their hands, did lift them to their heads, and sounded a tantara. Then the music went off, and the organ played a song of 5 parts, twice over. In the top of the organ, being 16 foot high, did stand a holly bush, full of blackbirds and thrushes, which at the end of the music did sing and shake their wings.
Mehmet was so enchanted that he demanded Dallam play for over 2 hours, while the humiliated English ambassador was left outside, fuming, as he waited in vain to kiss the Sultan's hand. The recital was a triumph. Dallam was given gold worth £20 by Mehmed, and was implored by the Sultan's advisers
to stay with them always, and I should not want anything, but have all the content that I could desire.
He was taken into Mehmed's privy chambers, where he was allowed to draw his sword in imitation of the Sultan, and was offered the pick of the Sultan's harim.
Either 2 of his concubines, or else 2 virgins of the best I could choose myself.
To whet his appetite, he was even allowed to spy on the harim women through a grate in the wall, where he saw
30 of the Grand Signior's concubines, and very pretty ones indeed. The concubines wore fine cloth made of cotton wool, as white as snow and fine as muslin, for I could discern the skin of their thighs through it. And then the guide stamped with his foot to make me give over looking, the which I was very loath to do, for that sight did please me wondrous well.
Dallam was the first recorded Englishman ever to see the Sultan's harim. It must have all seemed a long way from Warrington. Somewhat surprisingly, none of these enticements convinced Dallam to stay. In defiance of the Sultan, he persuaded the English ambassador to let him slip away under pretence of illness, and travel secretly to rejoin his ship, which was returning to London. As he left Constantinople, Dallam had one final, poignant encounter. To guide him, he was assigned a dragoman, a diplomatic translator and envoy, whom he described as
an Englishman born in Chorley in Lancashire. His name Finch. He was also in religion a perfect Turk, but he was our trusty friend.
As he reached the coast, Dalham took his leave of Finch. Two men from Lancashire, briefly united as friends, one a Christian headed west, the other a Muslim convert who had turned Turk, headed back east. In May 1600, the Hector docked in England, with a consignment of gifts and letters from the Queen Mother, Sophia Sultan, to Elizabeth. At first all seemed well. Sophia's translated letter acknowledged that you sent us a coach, it has arrived and has been delivered, it had our gracious acceptance. It also itemized the gifts sent in return, a robe, a sash, 2 gold-embroidered bath towels, 3 handkerchiefs, and a ruby and pearl tiara. Even more importantly, the elaborate gift exchange seems to have had its desired diplomatic effect of persuading Mehmed to ratify the Anglo-Turkish trade agreement. The Sultan's mother assured Elizabeth,
I will take action in accordance with what you have written. Be of good heart in this respect. I constantly admonish my son to act according to the treaty. I do not neglect to speak to him in this manner. God willing, may you not suffer grief in this respect.
Unfortunately, on closer inspection, Sophia's gifts paled in comparison with the lavish coach and organ sent to Constantinople. Sophia's Jewish intermediary, Esperanza Malki, had already been accused of withholding some gifts dispatched to Elizabeth 6 years earlier, and now had the temerity to address a letter directly to the Queen, asking if she could send Sophia rare distilled waters of every kind for the face and odoriferous oils for the hands. Perhaps unsurprisingly, no record survives of any response from Elizabeth to this request for perfume and hand lotion. In Constantinople, Esperanza Malki's luck ran out even before the Hector reached London. Fed up with the political control and financial corruption exercised by the harim, the Turkish imperial cavalry rose up against the Queen Mother, venting their fury on Esperanza. A Levant Company official described what happened.
The cavalry drew her out of her house. This was a Jew woman most dear to the Sultana, who by such grace with her accomplices governed in effect the whole empire, and was worth at her death millions. Her they hauled through the streets, forth at Adrianople Gate, and there killing her, after she had offered more for her life than their pay came to. They cut her into small pieces, every one that could get carrying back through the streets to their houses a piece of her flesh upon his knife's point.
Nothing quite so dramatic awaited the organ-maker Thomas Dalham. Having returned home, he married, had 6 children, and spent the next 30 years building some of the period's finest organs for King's College Chapel in Cambridge, the Scottish Chapel Royal, and the cathedrals in Norwich, Worcester, and Bristol. But he probably never forgot his grand performance in front of the Sultan in Constantinople, nor his glimpse of the harem. After 3 decades of trading with Muslim powers in North Africa and the Middle East, Elizabethans were beginning to express increased interest and some unease in what was happening in places like Morocco and Turkey. One outlet for such interests was London's theatre. Since the first commercial playhouses had opened in the 1570s, the stage had quickly become a touchstone for popular hopes and fears, concerning everything from witchcraft and popery to adultery and cross-dressing. The most fashionable and popular play in late 1587 was Tamburlaine. It had been written by a precocious young playwright barely out of his Cambridge studies, Christopher Marlowe. His inspired choice for his hero was Timur, a 14th century Muslim warlord. In just over 30 years, Timur led a series of spectacularly successful and brutal campaigns, laying waste to Central Asia, conquering Persia, and invading Russia. In Marlowe's hands, much of Tamburlaine's life is fictional, including his name. He is transformed into a lowly shepherd, a brilliant orator whose ceaseless and apparently amoral appetite for conquest both appalled and enthralled the Elizabethan audience. As he prepares to go into battle with the Sultan of Turkey, Tamburlaine congratulates his lieutenant for his rousing anti-Turkish rhetoric.
Well said, Theridamas. Speak in that mood, for will and shall best fitteth Tamburlaine, whose smiling stars give him assured hope of martial triumph ere he meet his foes. I that am termed the scourge and wrath of God, the only fear and terror of the world, will first subdue the Turk, and then enlarge those Christian captives which you keep as slaves.
Tamburlaine sounds and acts like a Christian agent sent to vanquish the Turks, ridding the world of their Islamic faith and promising to release the captives enslaved in their galleys. Even as Marlowe was writing, the English ambassador in Constantinople, William Harborne, was struggling to free Christian galley slaves too, albeit using more peaceable methods. The fascination with a mixture of faith, ambition, and ethnicity developed into staple theatrical fodder during the 1590s, as almost every Elizabethan dramatist began to include despotic sultans, deceitful Moors, renegade Christians, murderous Jews, and vulnerable princesses. The Jew of Malta was another great success for Marlowe, but his dominance of London's stage was to prove tragically short-lived. 3 years later, he was stabbed to death in a house in Deptford. But one man had been quietly learning his stagecraft by observing his fellow playwright. His name was William Shakespeare. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Shakespeare never put a Turkish character in any of his plays, with one peculiar exception. But he wrote a series of plays, mainly about English history, that were characterized by conflicts over royal succession, deposition, rebellion and civil war. Inevitably, the spectre that came to Shakespeare's mind time and again was the tyrannical, faithless, yet inscrutable Turk. His play, Richard II, culminates in the climactic moment of Richard's deposition. The Bishop of Carlisle warns of the dire consequences of dethroning a legitimate king.
My lord of Herefordshire, whom you call king, is a foul traitor to proud Hereford's king. And if you crown him, let me prophesy, the blood of English shall manure the ground, and future ages groan for this foul act. Peace shall go sleep with Turks and infidels, and in this seat of peace tumultuous wars shall kin with kin and kind with kind confound.
Carlyle's point is that deposing a king breaks the bonds and laws of nature, defined and decreed by God. By identifying Turks and infidels as similarly unnatural, the bishop predicts chaos and disaster through the language of religious difference. The Turk is political shorthand for a breakdown in the natural order of things. By the end of the 16th century, many Londoners had heard stories about English diplomats and artisans like William Harborne and Thomas Dallam, and their travels and adventures throughout the Muslim world, but their accounts were often circulated in random and unreliable ways, by gossip or by word of mouth. There was, however, one Englishman living in Islamic lands who had sufficient stature to broadcast news of his exploits so widely that he could be casually mentioned in a Shakespearean comedy, and everyone knew who he was. His name was Sir Anthony Shirley. Shirley's name appears on the London stage for the first time in Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. The play is set in Illyria on the Dalmatian coast, where near-identical twins, Sebastian and Viola, are shipwrecked and spend their time trying to find each other. For all its wit and humour, Twelfth Night is characterized by moments of unrequited love, loss, and tragedy. But it also contains a surprising number of references to the Orient and the Islamic world. At the time Shakespeare wrote the play, Illyria was no fantasy, but a region of the Turkish Empire, which by this time controlled most of the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa. This was clearly in his mind, as Twelfth Night is replete with references to Egyptian thieves, the gates of Tartar, notable pirates, and heathens. During the play, Sir Toby Belch goads his cowardly friend Sir Andrew Aguecheek into a duel with the cross-dressed Viola, and he teases him with dire threats about his adversary.
"Why, man, he's a very devil. I have not seen such a virago. I had a pass with him, rapier, scabbard, and all, and he gives me the stuck-in with such a mortal motion that it is inevitable. And on the answer, he pays you as surely as your feet hit the ground they step on. They say he has been fencer to the Sophie."
The terrified Sir Andrew is tricked into believing he is about to face a deadly warrior renowned for teaching swordsmanship to the fearsome Persian emperor. Sir Toby Belch was alluding to two real aristocratic rogues, Sir Anthony Shirley and his brother, Sir Robert. The audience would have heard immediately that he was punning on their name, Surely, and evoking their adventures in Persia. The Shirley brothers' notorious exploits were described in several travel books, and they were the subject of gossip throughout London. Sir Anthony and his party had left England in January 1598, bound for Venice, where he heard about the young Shah of Persia, who was said to be a gallant soldier, very generous to strangers, and a lavish host. And over the next 6 months his small entourage travelled across Ottoman territory, leaving behind them a dizzying trail of debt, dishonesty, and drunkenness wherever they went. Finally, in December, the group reached the Persian city of Qazvin. Sir Anthony could not have timed his entrance better. Shah Abbas I and his army of 10,000 soldiers had just defeated the Uzbeks. As he returned to Persia at the head of a triumphal procession, Abbas heard of Shirley's arrival and ordered a steward to present the Englishman with 20 gold pounds to sustain him until he was called for. His party was also furnished with apparel and horses in preparation for a meeting with the Persian king. They received sumptuous entertainment, spending over 2 months feasting, drinking, and hunting with the Shah's court. Gifts of horses, camels, mules, weapons, and jewels were exchanged, and if the reports are to be believed, Sir Anthony and Shah Abbas became virtually inseparable, in sporting and banqueting, and walking arm in arm through the city's streets. He even praised the Persian ruler's approach to political succession. In contrast to the Turks, rather than strangling his siblings upon his accession, the magnanimous Abbas only blinded them. Sir Anthony's Oriental adventures were so outlandish that the passing reference to them in Twelfth Night was all that Shakespeare needed for his audience to imagine a bombastic, swaggering, slightly ridiculous nobleman. By 1600, the playwright had developed a fascinating new compound figure, the Moor Turk. Shakespeare had little interest in Islam as a theology, only the characters that emerged from the myths and misunderstandings about it. They would soon coalesce to help create one of his most enduring tragic heroes. Othello is set in the Mediterranean world of Turks, Venetians, and Moors that was so familiar to a generation of London theatre-goers. The eponymous Moor Othello is an heroic warrior who marries outside his community and is pushed to his physical and emotional limits. For more than 300 years, most Shakespeareans in the English-speaking world were fixated with horror on Othello's blackness, and his seemingly unnatural union with the fair Desdemona. But Othello did not start life as a play about race in our modern understanding of the word. Shakespeare meant a group of people connected by common descent. The crux is Shakespeare's use of the word Moor. In Othello, Shakespeare exploited its dual meaning of Mohammedan or Muslim and Maurus or blackness. At the end of the play, having murdered Desdemona and realized the tragedy of his situation, Othello prepares to take his own life, but not before he undergoes one final, shocking transformation.
Set you down this, and say besides that in Aleppo once, where a malignant and a turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him thus.
Aleppo, the Syrian city where Anthony Jenkinson first met Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and which today has a very different tragic resonance. Although he could not have known it, Shakespeare had written Othello at the zenith of Elizabethan England's relationship with the Muslim world, which was about to come to an abrupt end. Queen Elizabeth never saw the play. She died in March 1603, aged 69, and was succeeded by the Stuart king, James I, who almost immediately opened negotiations for peace with Catholic Spain. In the summer of 1604, the Moroccan ruler Al-Mansur died of the plague, and his kingdom descended into a bloody civil war between his three sons. Elizabeth's other great Muslim ally, Sultan Mehmed III, had died of a heart attack a few months earlier. As the Spanish and English sat down at Somerset House to agree the Treaty of London, the only visible sign that remained of the Anglo-Turkish alliance was the Turkey carpet that covered the table between them. The new king had no interest in pursuing alliances with the Moors, or what he elsewhere called the faithless Turks. The Elizabethan age was over, and with it England's alliance with the Islamic world.